So, welcome to the ultimate stress test for common sense, where the passing grade is simply staying alive. Today, we're honoring 10 individuals who looked at the laws of physics and said, "Hold my beer." These are true stories of terminal stupidity. Warning, do not attempt any of this. These professionals were fired from life for a reason. 1. In the high-stakes world of street crime, there is a very fine line between being a terrifying predator and being a punchline in a police report. And our first protagonist, a Brazilian aspiring tough guy we'll call Mateo, decided to sprint across that line with the confidence of a gold medalist. Mateo had decided that honest work was for suckers, and that his true calling was liberating other people from their wallets. On this particular humid evening, he spotted his target. A man walking alone, looking calm, unsuspecting, and notably solvent. Now, in Brazil, the statistical probability of a random pedestrian being an off-duty police officer is high enough that you should probably just assume everyone is a cop until proven otherwise. But Mateo wasn't a man of statistics, he was a man of action. He approached the victim, pulled out his semi-automatic pistol, and initiated the robbery. Here is where the script went off the rails. The victim didn't scream, didn't beg, and didn't tremble. He just stood there, staring Mateo down with the bored expression of someone waiting for a bus. This lack of respect infuriated Mateo. He didn't just want the money, he wanted the fear. He felt the need to teach a lesson about who was in charge. His brilliant tactical mind decided that a pistol whip, striking the victim with the gun, was the necessary move to assert dominance. It's a move he'd seen in 100 action movies, but he forgot the one critical safety rule that even Hollywood prop masters adhere to. You don't keep your finger on the trigger when you're using a gun as a hammer. In a display of biomechanical incompetence that defies all logic, Mateo kept a white-knuckled death grip on the handle, his index finger hooked firmly and lovingly around the trigger of the loaded, chambered weapon. He wound up for a massive, wild haymaker swing, aiming for the officer's head to knock some respect into him. The physics of what happened next are both tragic and hilarious. As Mateo swung the heavy steel weapon in a violent inward arc, the barrel of the gun naturally rotated toward his own body. The moment the gun made violent contact with the officer's shoulder, the sudden deceleration caused a sympathetic muscle reflex. Essentially, when your hand experiences a sudden shock, it clenches involuntarily. Mateo's hand clenched. His finger squeezed. The gun did exactly what it was engineered to do. It fired. Because of the awkward, inward angle of his aggressive swing, the barrel was pointing directly at the center of his own chest at the exact millisecond of discharge. The bullet bypassed the victim entirely and drilled straight into the robber's heart. The off-duty officer didn't even have to unholster his own weapon. He simply watched in stunned silence as the mugger successfully protected the public from himself. Mateo collapsed, ending his criminal career not in a blaze of glory, but in a geometry lesson gone wrong, proving that the only thing more dangerous than a cop with a gun is an idiot who doesn't know how to hold one. 2. Deep in the suburbs of Kentucky, where the grass is blue and the do-it-yourself spirit sometimes bypasses the should-I-do-it-myself filter, lived a man named Earl who viewed professional exterminators as a scam invented by Big Pest Control. Earl had discovered a massive pulsing hornet's nest in his garden shed, a paper fortress containing hundreds of the most aggressive, hate-filled insects known to man. Most reasonable humans would see this and retreat, perhaps reaching for a phone or a flamethrower, but Earl reached for his trusty 5-horsepower shop vacuum. His logic, to be fair, had a certain elegant simplicity to it. Vacuum cleaners suck up dirt. Hornets are essentially airborne dirt. Therefore, the vacuum will solve the problem. He suited up in his protective gear, which consisted of a flannel shirt buttoned all the way to the top and a pair of safety squints, and marched into the shed like a ghostbuster on a budget. He fired up the machine, and the deafening roar of the motor filled the small space. Amazingly, the plan worked. As the angry hornets swarmed out to defend their queen, Earl wielded the nozzle like a sword, sucking them out of the air one by one. Thwump, thwump, thwump. The satisfying sound of biological missiles being accelerated at 100 miles per hour into a plastic drum filled Earl with the intoxicating rush of victory. For 20 minutes, he was the apex predator, cleansing his domain. Finally, the air was clear. The nest was empty. Silence returned to the shed, save for the high-pitched whine of the vacuum. But inside that plastic canister, a dark drama was unfolding. Earl had collected hundreds of hornets, but he hadn't killed them. He had merely pissed them off to a degree that is difficult to quantify. They were dizzy, compressed, disoriented, and fueled by a collective rage that could power a small city. Now, a smart man would have taped the nozzle shut, tossed the vacuum in a lake, and moved to a different state. Earl, however, was overcome with curiosity and the need to finish the job. He wanted to see his catch. He wanted to stomp on them. He wanted closure. In a move that future historians will cite as the peak of human hubris, Earl decided to open the canister right there in the shed. He unlatched the heavy plastic clips. Click, click, and lifted the motor unit off the drum. He expected a pile of dead bugs. What he got was a vertical eruption of vengeance. The hornets didn't disperse randomly. They exploded upward in a focused column, a black cloud of buzzing fury that instantly enveloped Earl's head and upper body. It wasn't a few stings, it was hundreds, delivered in seconds. The venom overload sent his body into immediate, catastrophic shock. He collapsed right next to the shop vac, which sat there humming innocently, having served as the Trojan horse for his own demise. Earl had successfully cleared the air, but he failed to calculate the cost of the ground war. 3. On the frozen, windswept banks of a river in the Russian tundra, two best friends, let's call them Ivan and Dmitri, stumbled upon the discovery of a lifetime and immediately decided to trade their lives for it. During a rare seasonal thaw, they spotted the unmistakable curved tip of a woolly mammoth tusk protruding from the mud. This wasn't just a fossil, this was retirement money, a pristine piece of white gold that could fetch tens of thousands of dollars on the black market. The only thing standing between them and a life of luxury was the Siberian permafrost. For those who skipped geology class, permafrost isn't just cold dirt. It is a mixture of soil, rock, and ice that has been frozen solid for 10,000 years and has the structural integrity of reinforced concrete. Ivan and Dmitri tried digging with shovels, which was about as effective as trying to carve a turkey with a spoon. They tried chipping at it with picks, but they were barely scratching the surface, and panic set in. They needed to get the tusk out now, before other scavengers arrived. They needed heat. And what is the most readily available source of heat for two guys with a truck in the middle of nowhere? Gasoline. Their plan was breathtakingly simple. Create a thermal bath to melt the ice. They siphoned gallon after gallon of fuel from their truck, pouring it lovingly into the excavation pit they had dug around the tusk. They didn't just dampen the soil, they created a swimming pool of volatile hydrocarbons. The liquid gasoline soaked into the ground, but more importantly, it began to evaporate, filling the deep, heavy pit with a dense, invisible cloud of explosive vapor. Now, anyone who works with fuel knows that the liquid burns, but the fumes explode. Ivan and Dmitri were not those people. They stood right at the edge of the pit, admiring their marinated mammoth tusk, waiting for the thaw to happen. To speed things up, or perhaps just out of habit, one of them decided to light a cigarette. He flicked the lighter. He didn't even have to drop it. The spark alone was enough to ignite the fuel-air mixture that had pooled around their legs. The result was not a gentle melting fire. It was a thermobaric detonation. The blast was massive, a concussive wave that didn't just melt the permafrost, it vaporized it. The explosion instantly killed both amateur paleontologists, shredding their clothes and ending their bloodlines in a fraction of a second. But the ultimate irony wasn't just their death, it was the fate of the prize. When the smoke cleared, the priceless woolly mammoth tusk, which had survived the Ice Age, the rise of humanity, and 10 millennia of freezing temperatures, had been blown into a million worthless splinters. They had destroyed the treasure to save time, and in doing so, ran out of time completely. 4. Munich, Germany, plays host every year to Oktoberfest, a cultural phenomenon that is less of a festival and more of a synchronized attempt by millions of people to destroy their own livers in a 2-week span. Amidst the tent cities, the roasting pork, and the ocean of lederhosen, we find a man who decided that simply drinking alcohol was too boring and needed to be elevated to the level of a circus stunt. Our protagonist, whom we shall refer to as Hans, was a self-styled beer athlete, a title that implies a level of physical discipline that was completely absent from his life. Hans was the kind of guy who looked at a 1-liter glass stein, known locally as a maas, and didn't see a beverage. He saw a challenge to his masculinity. On this fateful evening, surrounded by a table of friends who were equally impaired and serving as the worst kind of cheerleaders, Hans announced his master plan. He claimed he could consume the entire liter of heavy golden lager without using his hands. Now, usually, this trick involves bending over the table like a grazing cow, which is undignified but generally safe. Hans, however, was an innovator. He decided the most efficient way to achieve this was to lie flat on his back on the wooden beer bench, open his mouth like a baby bird waiting for a worm, and have his friends pour the pressurized, carbonated liquid directly into his gullet. The plan was a logistical nightmare from the start, mostly because it ignored the basic biology of the human throat. Swallowing is a complex reflex designed to work with gravity, not against a high-pressure hose. His friends, eager to see a spectacle, hoisted the heavy glass mug and began the pour. It wasn't a trickle, it was a deluge. The beer hit the back of Hans's throat with the force of a waterfall. Under normal circumstances, your epiglottis snaps shut to protect your windpipe when you swallow. But Hans was laughing, cheering, and trying to gulp down a tsunami all at once. His body's natural reflex when overwhelmed by fluid is to gasp for air. Hans gasped, but there was no air to be found, only Pilsner. The liquid bypassed his stomach entirely and flooded his lungs in a catastrophic event known as massive aspiration. Essentially, he waterboarded himself with his own drink. To the cheering crowd, the thrashing and sputtering looked like a performance, a testament to his commitment to the chug. They clapped and banged on the tables while Hans was literally drowning on dry land, in the middle of a landlocked city, surrounded by thousands of potential lifeguards who thought he was just having a great time. By the time the fun stopped and his complexion turned a shade of cyan usually reserved for printer ink, it was too late. The beer athlete had crossed the finish line into the afterlife, becoming the only person in the history of the festival to drown in a mug, proving that while beer is proof God loves us, breathing is still the mandatory subscription fee for life. 5. The tropical heat of the Philippines is not merely a weather condition. It is a physical weight that sits on your chest and demands relief, usually in the form of air conditioning. When that relief fails, people get desperate, and desperation is the mother of the Darwin Award. Enter June, a neighborhood handyman whose confidence was inversely proportional to his understanding of electrical engineering. June was the kind of guy who looked at a high-voltage warning sign and saw it merely as a suggestion for people who didn't know what they were doing. His neighbor had a broken AC unit, a rattling, ancient metal box jutting out of an exterior wall like a robotic tumor. And rather than paying a certified technician who might use expensive things like safety equipment or insurance, he hired Jun. June arrived on the scene wearing the official uniform of the amateur disaster, a sleeveless basketball jersey, cargo shorts, and a pair of rubber flip-flops that had lost their tread sometime in the late 90s. He carried a rusty screwdriver, a roll of electrical tape, and absolutely zero voltage testing gear. The setup for this tragedy was so perfect, it looked like a physics exam question on conductivity designed to trick first-year students. The AC unit had been leaking condensation for days, creating a massive, muddy puddle of water directly beneath the installation site. Jun, ignoring the little voice in his head that surely must have been screaming, planted his uninsulated all-aluminum extension ladder right in the center of this puddle. He basically built a lightning rod and decided to climb it. He ascended the metal rungs, his sweaty hands gripping the conductive rails, essentially turning himself into a giant, fleshy fuse in a very dangerous circuit. Once at the top, he faced the ultimate choice. Go find the breaker box and turn off the power, which would require walking down the ladder and into the house, or save 2 minutes and work on the unit live. Jun chose the path of least resistance, which ironically led to the path of most resistance. He decided to just be careful, which is the famous last thought of every electrician in the cemetery. He jammed his screwdriver into the casing to pry off the maintenance panel. The tool slipped, as cheap tools often do when wielded by sweaty hands, and the tip dove straight into the main 220-volt capacitor terminal. The electricity, which had been waiting patiently for a path to the ground, surged forward with the force of a freight train. It traveled through the screwdriver, clamped June's hand onto the handle, raced through his sweat-soaked torso, down his legs, through the aluminum ladder, and exited directly into the water puddle below. It was the perfect lethal loop. The massive current caused his muscles to contract violently, a phenomenon known as the no-let-go threshold. He wasn't just shocked. He was locked in a vibrating, sizzling embrace with the machine. He hung there, fused to the equipment, until the main breaker finally tripped, ending the flow of power and his life simultaneously. Jun had saved his neighbor $50 on a repair bill, but the invoice came due with his existence, serving as a crispy, tragic reminder that electricity is a predator that strikes the moment you stop respecting it. 6. In the sterile, stainless steel world of industrial brewing, the dangers are usually invisible, odorless, and strictly regulated by safety protocols that are written in the blood of previous employees. But for a veteran maintenance worker like Klaus, safety manuals were just annoying suggestions for rookies who didn't know the smell of a real brewery. Klaus worked at a massive facility in Germany, a place of high efficiency and even higher risks. His task for the day was routine, or so he thought. Clean out a colossal 50,000-gallon fermentation vat that had just been drained of liquid. The tank was a shiny, cavernous silo that had recently held enough lager to intoxicate a small army. The company rules were explicitly clear. Before entering any confined space, you must lower a sensor to test the oxygen levels and run ventilation fans for at least an hour to clear out any hazardous gases. Klaus, however, looked at his watch, then at the tank, and decided that he didn't have time for bureaucracy. He had been cleaning tanks for 20 years. He figured he could hold his breath if it smelled bad. This was a fatal miscalculation because the killer waiting for him was carbon dioxide, CO2. The byproduct of fermentation is CO2. It's what gives beer its bubbles. But in high concentrations, it is a silent, odorless assassin. Crucially, and this is the physics lesson Klaus skipped, CO2 is heavier than oxygen. When the beer is drained, the gas doesn't float away into the rafters. It sinks and settles at the bottom of the tank like an invisible, heavy fluid. The vat was empty of beer, but it was filled to the brim with 100% pure carbon dioxide. It was effectively a swimming pool of gas. Klaus placed his ladder into the hatch and began his descent into the belly of the beast. He felt fine at the top, where the ambient air from the room was still circulating. But the moment his head dipped below the rim of the hatch, he crossed the invisible boundary line into the kill zone. It wasn't like walking into smoke where you cough, sputter, and realize you need to get out. It was instantaneous. One breath of pure CO2 meant absolutely zero oxygen was reaching his brain. It's like unplugging a computer. The screen just goes black. There was no struggle, no panic, no dramatic clawing at his throat to escape. Klaus simply lost consciousness mid-step. He went limp and fell backward off the ladder, landing softly on the curved metal floor of the vat. He didn't die from the fall. The fall was just gravity moving a sleeping body. He died because he lay there at the bottom of the tank, breathing in lungful after lungful of nothingness, silently asphyxiating in the most peaceful way imaginable. When his coworkers found him an hour later, he looked like he was taking an unauthorized nap on the job. Klaus had gambled his life against basic chemistry, and chemistry won without even making a sound, proving that just because a tank looks empty doesn't mean it isn't full of death. 7. We find ourselves now in the picturesque heart of Italy, inside a bustling family-run pasta factory where tradition meets industrial-grade horsepower. Our protagonist is a young woman we'll call Isabella, who possessed two things in abundance: a magnificent waist-length mane of silken hair and a complete refusal to adhere to workplace safety regulations. Isabella regarded the mandatory hairnet not as a protective device, but as a fashion crime, a hideous constraint that dimmed her shine. She believed that she was the main character in a romance novel, and main characters do not wear mesh caps that make them look like lunch ladies. She worked on the production line next to the Dough Roller 3000. a massive, unforgiving beast of a machine, consisting of heavy steel cylinders designed to crush thick dough into paper-thin sheets of linguine with thousands of pounds of torque. The machine, unlike Isabella, did not care about fashion. It cared only about friction and rotation. On this tragic afternoon, Isabella dropped a small tool near the intake of the rollers. A sensible person would have hit the emergency stop button. A cautious person would have used a stick. Isabella, confident in her agility and worried about her hair getting mussed by the sudden movement, simply leaned in to grab it. As she dipped her head, gravity did its job. Her long, beautiful hair, unconstrained by the despised hairnet, cascaded forward like a waterfall of dark silk. It touched the spinning steel roller. In the world of industrial machinery, this is known as a nip point, but in Isabella's case, it was a death sentence. The friction was instantaneous. The rollers grabbed a few strands, which instantly became a few hundred, which instantly became the entire scalp. The machine didn't jam. It didn't pause. It simply pulled. Isabella was yanked forward with a force that far exceeded the strength of her neck muscles or her skeletal structure. It wasn't a slow drag. It was a violent, sudden jerk that pulled her headfirst into the mechanism before she could even scream. The factory floor, usually filled with the rhythmic sound of production, was silenced by the gruesome reality of physics. Isabella had prioritized her vanity over her survival, refusing to tie back her hair because she wanted to look beautiful while making pasta. In a grim twist of irony, the very feature she was so proud of, her long, flowing locks, became the rope that dragged her out of the gene pool. She died instantly, a victim of the delusion that safety rules are just suggestions for ugly people, leaving behind a pristine hairnet that, had it been worn, would have saved her life. 8. In a rural province of China, we encounter a tragedy that escalates from clumsy mistake to mass casualty event, with a speed that is truly baffling. It begins with a man we'll call Wei, a modern enthusiast of technology who was seemingly glued to his smartphone. For Wei, this device wasn't just a phone, it was his external brain, his wallet, and his soul. While visiting a public restroom, specifically a traditional open-pit toilet, which is essentially a deep septic tank in the ground, Wei was navigating the perilous task of scrolling while squatting. Gravity, as it often does, seized the opportunity. The phone slipped from his hand and plummeted into the dark, foul-smelling abyss below. Now, a rational human being looks at a phone floating in a cesspool of human waste and says, "Well, I guess I need a new phone." Wei, however, operated on a sunk cost fallacy that would make a gambler blush. He decided he was going in after it. He removed the cover and jumped into the pit. Here is the science lesson Wei missed. Septic tanks are not just filled with waste. They are filled with a heavy, invisible blanket of hydrogen sulfide and methane gas. These fumes displace oxygen and can cause unconsciousness in seconds. The moment Wei hit the bottom, he didn't find his phone. He found immediate asphyxiation. He passed out instantly. But the story doesn't end there. It gets much, much worse. Wei's mother, seeing her son vanish into the muck, panicked. Driven by maternal instinct but lacking any understanding of gas toxicity, she jumped in to save him. She too took one breath of the toxic air and collapsed. Then came Wei's father, who saw his wife and son unconscious and jumped in to rescue them. He joined the pile. Then Wei's wife arrived, screamed, and jumped in. Then two neighbors, hearing the commotion, rushed over and, you guessed it, jumped into the pit to help. It was a conga line of death, a domino effect of good intentions meeting bad chemistry. In the span of 5 minutes, 6 people had entered the pit, and 6 people had been overcome by the fumes. By the time emergency services arrived with actual breathing equipment, it was too late for everyone involved. They were all suffocated by the waste fumes, a pile of bodies resting on top of the object of desire. And the ultimate stinging irony? The phone was never recovered. It remains there, likely ruined by the liquid anyway, a cheap piece of electronics that demanded a blood sacrifice of half a dozen people, proving that while a smartphone is smart, it can certainly make its owner tragically stupid. 9. We travel down under to the sun-baked coast of Australia, a continent that seems actively designed by Mother Nature to kill humans in as many creative ways as possible. Our hero is a tourist named Dazzler, a man whose confidence was built on a foundation of ignorance and lager. Dazzler was at a beach in Queensland, a stretch of sand famous for its beauty and, seasonally, for the presence of the box jellyfish, Kyrnex fleckeri. For those unaware, the box jellyfish is not like the annoying jellyfish you poke with a stick. It is widely considered the most venomous creature on Earth. Its tentacles are covered in millions of microscopic harpoons that fire neurotoxins strong enough to stop a human heart in 2 minutes. The beach was covered in signs. Big, red, terrifying signs with pictures of skulls and jellyfish, essentially screaming, "Do not swim. Death is in the water." Dazzler, however, looked at these signs and decided they were meant for weaker, lesser men. He turned to his friends, puffed out his chest, and uttered the famous last words of the Australian idiot. "They won't bother me, mate. I'll be right." He sprinted into the surf, diving headfirst into the warm water, feeling like the king of the ocean. The ocean, specifically a translucent, basketball-sized blob floating nearby, disagreed. Dazzler swam directly into a curtain of tentacles, trailing 10 feet behind the creature. The reaction was instantaneous. It wasn't just a sting, it was an electrocution. Thousands of nematocysts fired into his skin, pumping a lethal cocktail of toxins directly into his bloodstream. Dazzler didn't even have time to swim back to shore. The pain was so blindingly intense that his body went into immediate shock, and the venom began shutting down his cardiovascular system before he could even process the regret. He flailed for a moment, looking back at his friends on the beach who thought he was just waving, before his heart simply stopped beating. He washed up on the sand a few minutes later, a victim of his own arrogance. The jellyfish, true to Dazzler's prediction, was indeed not bothered in the slightest. It just kept floating, having effortlessly removed a creature that was millions of times its size, but possessed a fraction of its survival instinct. 10. Our final tale of woe takes us to the romantic cliffs of the Amalfi Coast in Italy, where a honeymoon was about to end not with a bang, but with a very long drop. Meet Marco, a passionate man who had just married the love of his life, only to discover on their very first night as husband and wife that she had been unfaithful. The confession took place in their luxury honeymoon suite on the 10th floor, a room with a stunning balcony overlooking the rocks below. Marco was consumed by a blind, red-hot rage. He wasn't thinking, he was reacting. He decided that he wanted her out of his life, and symbolically, he wanted her baggage out first. He grabbed her massive hard-shell suitcase, which was packed to the brim with clothes, shoes, and toiletries, weighing easily 60 pounds. He dragged it to the balcony, screaming insults, fueled by adrenaline and the drama of the moment. He lifted the heavy bag over his head, preparing to hurl it into the void as a final goodbye. But Marco, in his fury, had failed to account for the details of his own wardrobe. He was still wearing his expensive wedding suit, a tailored jacket with reinforced, sturdy buttons on the cuffs. As he hoisted the bag, the fabric handle of the heavy suitcase snagged perfectly, tightly, and undeniably around the bottom button of his right sleeve. It was a 1,000,000-to-1 catch. Marco heaved the bag forward with all his might, putting his entire body weight into the throw. The suitcase cleared the railing, flying out into the open air. But it didn't fly alone. The handle pulled the button pulled the sleeve pulled the jacket, and the jacket pulled Marco. The momentum of the 60-pound anchor yanking his arm created a lever effect that his legs couldn't counter. He was pulled off his feet and over the waist-high railing before his brain could even register what had happened. He plummeted 10 stories down, locked in a death spiral with his wife's luggage. He landed on the rocks below, lying next to the scattered remains of her wardrobe. Marco had let his anger take the wheel, but it was a simple plastic button that drove him off the cliff, proving that when you try to throw away your past, you better make sure you aren't attached to it. 901. We just watched 6 people die for a smartphone and a guy explode for a tusk. Let's test your greed in the comments. What is the absolute lowest amount of cash you would accept to jump into that specific septic tank for 60 seconds? Everyone has a price. Drop yours below so I can judge you. Subscribe and like if your dignity costs more than an iPhone.